amazed that the development office asked me to do things, but I tend to be,
Turn it off.
other than being mechanically very adept, I tend to be a really critical, sometimes negative person, and I know we're all about insight and inspiration here and everything. Are we getting feedback? No.
Okay.
So anyway, again, you know, we're all about inspiration, defining moments here. But I've always been interested in, say, the young Karl Marx, who thought that in fact that you make this is a defining moment. That you make progress in the world, and that you actually move forward and you accomplish things by being, as he said, ruthlessly critical about everything existing, right? So, you know, along those lines, I'd like to really just dive in a little bit to what we mean by a defining moment, what that could possibly be about, because it seems to me that this whole notion of defining moments is kind of a modern construction. I mean, looking back historically, there's a way in which defining moments are all tied up with us and our kind of moment in socioeconomic propaganda history. So, and I'm going to get into what that means and what I think it means. And as I understand it, we're going to have a lot of time to discuss, which is good. So basically, you think about just, do I have a blackboard? No. I'm going to have to sketch it in the sky. Imagine timelines, right? You probably were all tortured with historical timelines at some point in your past, high school, elementary school, who knows. But imagine that I put up, say, I have to imagine the timeline. Imagine I put up 1776, 1789, 1848, 1917. All of a sudden, most of you know what I'm talking about, right? There's a picture that emerges in your head, changes in time, revolutions, all that stuff is clicking. And all I have to do is put up these numbers, right? Imagine instead that I put up 1522, 1824, 1952, 1975. It's not true. What's he talking about? You have to puzzle that there must be some thread connecting these numbers. There must be some thread connecting these timelines. Well, the one, of course, is all about so-called political revolution. The other one, we have no idea, right? Now, my point is that we are put together to think about defining moments in history already, based on narratives that we tell about the past. A defining moment is a very fungible, odd kind of thing, right? Revolutions, if you go back 250 years, revolutions were not sudden changes in time. They weren't, you know, overturning the monarchy, chopping off the king's head. They were coming back around, right? The original meaning. They were cyclical. They were not changes that move us forward. They were things that bring us back around. But somehow now, in our place in time now, we think about revolutions, we think about defining moments. We're in this progressive narrative, right? Timeline moving forward, always changing. And I think, in some ways, that we are epistemologically trapped in this metaphor. We are unable sometimes to step outside it. Because when you think about a defining moment, it's a pretty weird thing. You know, what is it in the flow of time? What makes it defining? What makes it not defining? In fact, I would submit that it's the narratives that we construct for ourselves in time that make these things defining or not, right? In and of itself, the moment is, it's meaningless. How much time do I have, Deborah?
More.
Yeah, like 10, 15. I want to pace myself a little bit. So let me do something totally different. Frost Nixon, I just happened to see that last night, and I think it's a good illustration. Who's seen it? And who saw the original interviews? Anybody? Yeah, because I went back to check those up too. Very interesting. Now, that was a fascinating movie that pertains to this topic because there is the so-called defining moment in that movie, and it's very fleeting but very important, right? It's when essentially Nixon, you know, physically falls apart. The space drops. He looks defeated. That's it. It's this little fleeting moment. And in the movie, they make a big deal out of that. And in the movie, it was very smart. The director, essentially, and Frost as well, they talk about what TV has done to make us define the world, right? I think as one of the characters said, you know, I could have ripped apart everything that Nixon ever did in terms of documents and showed that he was wrong, and it wouldn't have had that much impact as just watching this baseball on national TV. And so, what I mean is there's a way in which, you know, starting probably in the early 20th century, maybe the late 19th, but probably just the early 20th, we as a mass democracy have been conditioned to think about defining moments in terms of radio, in terms of TV, in terms of images, as immediate things that change the course of history. And again, this course now for us being ever forward, moving progressively. That's our image, right? But it could be otherwise, and I think this is where I'm going to start to get a little negative and critical, but you know, you think about Walter Lippmann, for example. Walter Lippmann, many of you may know him only through, I think it was Chomsky who referred to his phrase manufacturing consent, right? Well, Walter Lippmann was a towering figure in the early 20th century in America. He was a public relations and public opinion guy, and he developed this theory of, I guess you'd call it pseudo-environments. And again, I'll have to, my imaginary chalkboard, just imagine I'm drawing a triangle here, right? And Lippmann's perceptual triangle was beautiful in its simplicity, right? Because his essential argument was, we are limited creatures. We do not directly deal with the world because the world is too complicated for us. So what we do is we essentially have to create two-dimensional, stereotypical ways of interacting with the world in order just to comprehend it, right? So in the course of being, we simplify the world in all these different ways. And for him, that meant we lived through cliches, we lived through two-dimensional images. It's really a very grim view of what human beings are, right? But it was also an incredibly important view because it was acted upon. Note that he wrote this in the 1920s. In the 1930s, as some of you may recall, people start acting on this kind of stuff all over, not just in Germany and Italy and Japan, but also in the United States. People started using this to shape forms of propaganda. And the idea that Lippmann had, of course, was that we can't see the world for what it is. We can't see that defining moment for what it is. We have to actually track it through our prior experience. We have to make sense of it through what we've already constructed out of the world. Which means, in very scary terms, for him, this became quite a tool of manipulation. Because if you can create a stereotype through repetition or what have you, then at a certain moment you can activate that stereotype. You can create a moment that activates the stereotype in people all over a nation and then prompts them to act. Well, Jacques Ellul, writing in the 40s after the disaster of World War II, was in some ways darkly inspired by Lippmann and said, you know, Lippmann had it exactly right. Because the whole idea he came up with was, I believe, what he called integration propaganda. He said, we're used to thinking about agitprop, right? Agitation propaganda. Propaganda that makes people do things, right? But instead, he said, what we really should be focusing on is integration propaganda. Propaganda that keeps things the way they are. Propaganda that primes the people in a country to act at a certain moment when those things are activated, right? And so what the image that comes out of Lippmann and comes out of Ellul is a notion that we are always being primed and manipulated as a people for action at certain defining moments, right? And then, you know, when people in government or advertising or something else can essentially draw on those metaphorical, imagistic resources that they've created, they make people do things one way or the other. Now, let me then move on to an example of this that should be familiar to all of you. Comes up here. Anybody remember this one?
Yeah.
All right. This is a nice example.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Now, I think we'll all agree that, at least for Michael Dukakis, this was a defining moment. And not a good one, right? Now, it's good to think about what exactly is going on there. If you think in terms of Lippmann and Alul, what the Republican Party and company is doing there is they're actually drawing on all these integration propaganda resources that have been built up over time and just unleashing the flood, right? It's as if people were primed for that, and then the kind of latent racism and everything else in the country is supposed to come boiling up. And in fact, this along with the infamous tank ad, two fleeting images, right? Together, there's a lot of arguments to be made. My friend Jonathan, who's a political junkie and works on campaigns, says common wisdom is that those two things together largely work to destroy him. So I mean, it's amazing. First of all, the shallowness of our political dialogue now, the way, in fact, it does seem to track with the ideas of Alul and Lippmann, and the way defining moments are really quite creepy in the political arena, right? Now, I'm going to cut this really short because I think we've got a lot to talk about already. I just would say now let's move on to, anybody ever been to Amsterdam Schiphol Airport? I guess sadly I have to direct this to the men in the audience. Who's ever been in the bathroom at Schiphol Airport? You notice anything in there?
Really narrow.
They have flies in the urinals. I mean, not just the ones that we started to see here. This happened to me years ago. But there is an exquisitely drawn kind of 17th century era fly drawn at a very specific point in all those urinals. And I remember I came through Schiphol years ago. It was probably in the, I don't know if it was the late 80s, early 90s. And it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like this. They're all over now, but then it was a new thing. And I remember being baffled about this thing. Is that thing there? This is something. And my defining moment came later that year when I was in Germany reading the Herald Tribune and whole things. Reading the Herald Tribune in the back. I had a lot of time on my hands. I read the whole thing back then. But in the back there was this little thing about the new management team taking over Schiphol Airport in Holland and how it was, they were going to take over Kennedy too. It was how it was a new model. And one of the things about their management style had to do with this fly in the urinal. And the idea was that there was a spillage problem in the urinals. The point is, men don't always point to the right spot. So you get stuff all over the place, right? And so it cost a lot of money. You had people mopping up all the time after all these guys who couldn't point correctly, and you had this big mess. And what they did is they created a team. How can we solve this? And one of the main issues was there is a sweet spot in the urinal. If you point at the sweet spot, you will not have spillage. If you do not have spillage, you cut down on mopping costs and cleanup costs. The point then became, how do we get them to point at the sweet spot? At which point they went to their psychology bag and said, what can make people point at this sweet spot in the urinal? And they came up with certain kinds of bugs, flies. If you create a target, it will work. And in fact, the thing that really creeped me out, by the way, because I was a total sucker for this, I did the same thing, I realized in retrospect, without knowing why. And the thing that happened apparently was they found that after painting these exquisite flies in the urinals, something like 85 to 90% of spillage wiped out. Right? So it was this just genius moment. So by spending almost no money, they completely revamped their cleanup costs. They solved the problem. Everything else. Now, on the one hand, it's a piece of genius, right? It's very Dutch, in my estimation. It's like the Germans would have thrown up a sign, 9, you're pointing there. That wouldn't work, would it? You'd be like, no, You don't have to do that. But no, the Dutch came on the fly. And the reason I bring all this up, and the reason it has to do with Willie Horton, is some of you may have noticed that in the new Obama administration, behavioral economics is all the rage. This is, I went to Chicago, so I knew some of these characters. Cass Sunstein, some of these people in the econ and political science departments at Chicago, very big into behavioral economics. And this Sipple moment is one of the examples that comes up in behavioral economics, right? As a way to get people to do things without quite knowing why they're doing it, right? And the thing I want to bring up here is, for all its merits, I find this to be a really problematic thing, right? If we get people, if we manipulate them to do things without them knowing quite why, then we start to move down the path of Lippmann and Ellul and everybody else. This is something that Noam Chomsky pointed out years ago. But in fact, we have to ask ourselves, right? These defining moments, if we want to change the course of society, if we want to do all these things, is it okay just to manipulate people into them? Should people be rational actors? Can they be? I mean, this is a wide open discussion, but it seems to me, if your model is behavioral economics, manipulating people to do things you want them to do and that you know are good for society, it still might not be okay, right? So with that, I think with the urinal image, and we will we'll close up there, and I'll hand it over to Sissy, and then